Professor Brian Castro is author of 11 novels, including the renowned Shanghai Dancing. His works have seen him receive multiple literary honours, such as the Patrick White Award for Literature and the Prime Minister's Prize for Poetry. Professor Castro is in conversation with Pookong Kee, the immediate past BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University and Emeritus Professor at the University of Melbourne. The Foundation for Australian Studies in China acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which this interview was conducted.
Professor Castro has a rich cultural heritage, a heritage that reflects the complex interaction between China and the West, including European trade, political and missionary influences in southern China dating back to the 19th century. Can you please tell us about this rich Chinese, English, Jewish, Portuguese, and Spanish heritage and how it has shaped Brian Castro as a person, a literary writer, and an academic?
Well, I think I've been very privileged to be born into all these different cultures and languages. It's one thing, I think, to come from a specific country and never to step outside of that in terms of one's consciousness or subconsciousness, put it that way. So out of all these cultures, I have obviously benefited from a richness, but that richness also comes at a price, so that one is never entirely at home, if you like, in one specific culture. That has been a good thing, and also, I think, a source of anxiety and insecurity, I think, certainly in my younger age. But now I'm a little bit more at home in lots of different cultures. I think I can adapt very easily. So that's come at a price, but I think it's also a reward.
You have spoken about a sense of isolation and insecurity from being away from home at a young age. How has that exile and its loneliness been reflected in your writings and professional careers?
I think because I was sent to boarding school at the age of 11, I was not only isolated from my family, but I was in a situation which I could jokingly say was like a jail. So I was thrown back on my own resources, and consequently, my only means of communication was to write letters to my family, to my friends back in Hong Kong and Macau. But that came at a price as well, because these letters were always censored by the teachers, just in case we said something bad about the school. So I was living under a double oppression, if you like. Now, this, as I said before, was also a plus, but also a negative. The plus was that I learned to actually use language in a way that was not exact. It was not about my feelings, but about another voice and another character, and to put this in a kind of almost fictional situation in order to get these letters through, especially to my friends, and they could see the kind of voice and the humor behind it. So I guess, in a way, that was a formation of becoming a writer, was to become something else as well as oneself, but not expressing everything, all one's feelings. So one had to, you felt things, but you had to say it in a different way. So that was an exercise, I think, in writing in a way. Yes, and I think that being in exile was also very important to hear the silence of my own life, to hear the fact that there was no one to dialogue with, especially, I think, in terms of language. So I was thrown back onto the English language. They did not teach Chinese in 1961 in Australia. There was no way of speaking with any family. I spoke Cantonese at home. My father spoke Portuguese. Our lingua franca was English, of course. So this richness of language was suddenly taken away from me, and I had to reinvent myself.
Australia has a long education tie with Asia. The Colombo Plan, launched in 1950, brought thousands of young Asian students to Australian universities and other institutions of higher education. Many of Southeast Asia's political, business, professional, and academic leaders were trained under the Colombo Plan, which also paved the way for the gradual relaxation of the White Australia policy from the 1960s. However, those students were mostly young adults. You, in contrast, came to Sydney in 1961 at a very tender age of 11 years for your schooling. In what significant ways has Australia changed from the 1960s, when the White Australia policy was still in place, to the present day, when Australia considers itself to be a multicultural society?
Yes, I think the infrastructure has broadened, the support system has broadened and extended itself. And there are so many ways now that foreign students can actually access support, both in terms of scholarships and in terms of the accessibility to resources, which I don't think I ever had. One thing was that there was no scholarships available to me, even though I did very well in high school, because I was a foreign student. There was no internal or external scholarships for students at that time. Whereas now, I think there's tremendous support, especially at universities, for students who merit scholarships, to be able to get them, to access them, to travel, to have exchanges, basically the opportunities are far more extensive than I had experienced. For one thing, having graduated, I could not get a Commonwealth scholarship because I was not considered to be part of the Commonwealth, even though Hong Kong was a part of the Commonwealth, as it were. So I had to work. I had to go out and work as a salesperson in a department store, in a factory, and simply to support myself because my father was not very wealthy. So in order to do all those things, I had to keep passing my exams well. Otherwise, I would have been sent back. So the threats were big, but things have changed so much now. I think, for one thing, if I could say to foreign students, to international students, to Chinese students, and that would be to participate as much as possible in every opportunity that is thrown your way. The only way I could participate in that time as a boy was to actually do some sports, because Australia was a sporting, crazy nation in that sense. So I participated in lots of sports, and that helped me because I was invited to friends' places to stay for holidays. And to learn a lot about Australian life, which I would never have if I stuck to my own system or my own friends or my own language. So in this way, I think it was so important to be inside other people's lives. And again, I think that also made me into a writer. I was able to observe other families, Australian families, in their homes.
That need to be independence and the necessity of looking after yourself by being engaged with a wide range of our Australian experiences has, of course, enriched your subsequent career as a writer. And in your writings, the theme of biography, and in many instances, autobiography, I think has very, very richly reflected, that period of being a young student in Australia and having to as I said, look after yourself. You have led a highly cosmopolitan life with time spent in Hong Kong, Macau, the United States, and France, and Australian cities such as Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide. How has this cosmopolitan life affected your world view and influenced your writings?
Well, I think being cosmopolitan is more or less related to cities. And you're right, I've lived in many different cities, but I mainly lived outside of cities. So the provincial life was very important to me too, because cities are global to a certain extent. One is getting mainly, I think, American culture, American television, American expressions, especially in Australia. It's been inundated, I think, by American culture in many respects. And by living outside of cities, I actually could absorb, I think, the more traditional Australian lifestyles and cultures, if I could put it that way. So I think that has also enriched me. A lot of my books are not set inside the big cities, but outside of them. And I think that having lived in different countries, just through absorption, but also absorption of the languages. When I was in France, of course, I tried not to speak English at all. So speaking French immediately gave you some entree into the culture and depth of people's lives. And you got accepted a lot quicker by speaking that language. And that's one of the things that I think Australia is lacking in, because not only is it very insular by just being Anglophone, but it doesn't actually try to encourage the teaching of languages to the extent at which it's, it should be starting in primary school. So I think I see this great lack of understanding of other cultures, particularly of China, because Anglophone people are not learning how to speak and how to write Chinese. This is, to me, very important. I, of course, can just speak Cantonese, but I cannot read it because I was sent here at too early an age. There was nobody going to teach me how to read Chinese. So I feel that as a lack. But I feel that also, while a lot of Chinese people can actually speak English and read English to a large extent, the other way is not happening. So if that could be my comment on Australia-China relations, if you like. There was an opening at one stage where Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who could speak Mandarin quite well, was giving a lead to this country in terms of making those advances culturally. And there's no way of understanding a culture totally if you do not understand the language.
Australia's relationship with Asia and its growing Asian Australian communities have become recurrent topics of public interest in this country. You have commented on the so-called Asian immigration debates of 1984 and the construction and use of social categories such as Chinese Australian and Asian Australian. Can you share with us your perspective on Australia's engagement with the Asian region, its growing but diverse Asian Australian communities, and what it means to be a Chinese Australian and an Asian Australian?
Yes, there are two things there. I think one thing is, as a writer, to be categorized with a hyphen, Chinese Australian, did two things. One was that it switched off the interest amongst Australian readers, because they kind of said, well, you're categorized, you're boxed into this particular thing. We are not quite interested in, this topic, perhaps. And also there are certain stereotypes that come in to this categorization. And you are therefore restricted in a way from writing about other things. In other words, if I wrote a novel with an Australian character, with an Australian voice, it would be deemed inauthentic. So this kind of notion of authenticity, of tradition, doesn't quite work that with someone who's hyphenated, as it were. So I guess in a way that's my writing career in the early part was set back by that, because I was intimidated by saying, oh, I can write in any voice whatsoever. Well, you can't. I think the growing historical and cultural settings were becoming such that you can't step outside of your own role, so you're stuck in it. I think the growing community, as you mentioned, of Australian and Chinese people could change this kind of boxing, if you like. And certainly we are seeing more and more multicultural writers coming up, Indigenous writers. And this is starting to perhaps change it from this very central notion of what Australian literature is all about. The stereotypes have to be pushed to the margins, as it were, and the fringes will come into the center. All these different subcultures will probably act in a more inducive way to notions of what Australian literature is all about. And I think that I would like to see less of national adjectives in front of literature, not so much global literature, because I don't particularly subscribe to that as well, but actually kind of changing the idea of what Australian is. This is the kind of transformation I would like to see in the future.
Make sure to watch part 2 of our interview with Professor Brian Castro and our full collection of conversations with some of Australia's leading authors.